Your new book, what's the premise you're trying to convey?
I am trying to tell lost history, history that, in a sense, has been hidden from us, the narrative we do not know that has been submerged, paved over by the victors. The victors tell our history. I maintain that our history has been told by those who do not want us to know the extent to which we were penetrated by communist agents, by the hundreds, who subverted us, who essentially stole our character, stole our country, and made totalitarianism palatable. And I argue that we are essentially undergoing a second totalitarian wave with the advent of Islam in this expansionist phase that we're now living on since 9/11.
What's the connection between fascism, statism, and Islamism?
Well, these are all central controlled creeds, ways of controlling people, ways of controlling speech, controlling thought. These would be some of the commonalities. Communism, of course, totalitarian, collectivist, with a lexicon that you cannot violate. There are certain words that become very verboten, taboo. Islam is very similar. It's collectivist, it's totalitarian, and again, there is no criticism of Islam under Islamic law. So you have the same notions of control. And what I find through history is that when you have this kind of these means of control of people, controlling their speech, controlling their thought, you do see over time mental conditioning that people would talk about in terms of brainwashing. You stop thinking about the problems, you stop thinking about liberty.
How do you feel the Obama administration has exploited the race card in making taboo criticism of Obama, his administration, and White House policies?
Well, it's not just the race card. I think that we've become sensitized to a point of not discussing the socialistic nature of his policies, not criticizing his own background, his own education, his mentors who come out of really, it's like an incubator of radicalism, communism, domestic terrorism, and indeed very radical trends in America, and this was his formative creed. Whether you're talking about Rashid Khalidi, who used to be a mouthpiece for the PLO, Frank Marshall Davis, early on his early mentor, a known communist who was actually on a list by the FBI in the event of war between America and the Soviet Union to be picked up. He was that dangerous. He was an organizer in Hawaii. Bill Ayers, who may very well have written his very praised autobiography in praise of my father. These are the kinds of people we were not allowed to really speak of. We would get slapped on the hands by the media, by other pundits, in terms of it being criticism, whether it was considered racial criticism, whether it was considered out-of-bounds discussions of socialism and such. So, unfortunately, people acquiesce, and our most political leaders acquiesce.
During the Cold War, is there any question that there was a political movement, a campaign in the U.S. to change the society?
Oh, absolutely, no question. And yet, when we go back to the time, we see that the debate hinged on between the anti-communists who said there was a communist conspiracy to overthrow the Constitution, and the anti-communists who, that's what they were called, who argued vociferously that there was no communist penetration, there was no communist conspiracy. But what we have since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, we have our access to some of the Soviet archives that have opened up in that period that confirm the presence of hundreds of American traitors who are actually working for Stalin. This is absolute confirmation of the conspiracy, and yet there's a lag between what we know, the evidence, and how we still regard that period of history.
How is the communism of today? England has socialist parties, Canada has socialist parties. How is the socialism that you recognize in the Obama administration different from the socialism that exists in these Commonwealth nations? And how is that different from the communist movement from the 50s?
Well, there is no gulag anymore. I think at a certain point, the Soviet Union actually realized it was not the most beneficial for their success, for their continued acceptance in the West, to have a gulag. And this was partly due to many of these truth tellers that I write about in my book, who actually came out even before Solzhenitsyn to tell us what was going on inside the Soviet Union, whereby slave labor was actually the engine of any economic well-being that they may have had. They were depending on millions and millions of people inside the gulag doing this work. In more modern times, I think that the left has learned, because a lot of these things have just seeped into our tissues. There's no longer quite the demarcation that we once would have recognized between communists and other parties. So much we've been co-opted by so much of the communist project, really. But I think that in our time, we see the single person isolated, the single person made an example of, whether it's a Michelle Bachmann in the Congress, where last year she was utterly castigated and demonized for raising questions about Muslim Brotherhood penetration inside the policymaking chain. This shut up everyone else. So in other words, you don't need to take hundreds, thousands of people off to the gulag. What you do is you make an example of an individual, and you essentially smear them out of existence, isolate them, and other people follow suit. And I've heard this from many people, that inside our security agencies, Homeland Security, Pentagon, and so on, people will say, I don't want to be another Michelle Bachmann, I don't want to be another one of, for example, the anti-Islamic so-called trainers, by name Matt Dooley, Stephen Coughlin. I don't want to be isolated, I don't want to lose my job. So gulags are no longer necessary, but the examples are made. The examples are made, and that we are controlled by this, it would seem, very ridiculous name-calling. I mean, that's essentially what it is, but people respond, and they are silenced.
How about the tabooing of questions of the Obama eligibility for office? By creating
I can talk
this
a lot
taboo.
about that.
Would you please?
Yes, I would. I have written, I wouldn't say extensively, but I have written, probably 6, 8, 10 columns in the space of a year's time, exactly about the eligibility issue, about the birth certificate forgery, about court cases that have gone on in courts, for example, in Georgia, in New Jersey, the investigation out in Arizona, the investigation in Hawaii, and I can tell you, my column is distributed to roughly 100 or so papers. I have they call them clients, I have papers that will not run anything I write, no matter how factual it is. They will not write anything on the eligibility issue. And I would say one of the greatest offenders of that is a paper that is now defunct in its daily newspaper form, the Washington Examiner, which is one of my more notable clients. They told me that they would not run a single column about anything having to do with President Obama's eligibility. It wasn't so much that they thought I was wrong or out of bounds with what I was reporting, but they didn't want to be responsible for the editor actually said blood in the streets, which suggests to me that they actually bought into it and yet did not want to see the story taken to its logical conclusion, which would be impeachment. Mm-hmm. Certainly, if these charges were proven, and in this particular man's opinion, blood in the streets. And I said, you know what, I think you're saying that we actually live in a thuggish nation if we cannot have rule of law. Yeah. And you're living in fear if you're afraid of this story. The media is afraid of this story. They will not report it. It is really the crime of the century, the crime of our history in terms of what the implications are. But it is something that everyone runs from.
Should challenging the authenticity of the birth certificate be tabooed and pariahified like Sheriff Joe Arpaio?
Absolutely not. That investigation, the evidence that the Sheriff Joe Arpaio's investigation compiled, should have naturally been taken up by a prosecuting attorney, taken up by the Congress, and examined. Is it true or is it not? If it's not true, fine, we can dispense with it. If these charges, if this forensic evidence is compelling, steps should be taken. This would be fraud on a scale unimaginable. But there's an abdication of responsibility in the Congress, in the prosecutorial class, in the media, so we have dysfunction in our government.
And finally, as a journalist yourself, how complicit do you feel the mainstream journalists have been in defending the statism policy within this administration?
Well, I think that very complicit. I think that they are very often kind of serving almost as a Praetorian guard to the president. They're not interested in following stories, and I don't necessarily think it's always a nefarious plot. It's just their general tendency. It's their reflex. When you go back to the Benghazi scandal as it was unfolding last fall, I remember being so struck by when it actually came out. Now, this would be mainstream media sourcing. I think it was Reuters or CBS was coming out with some of the real-time information that we found out that there was understanding of what was going on, and this was news of the day in terms of Washington understanding that the embassy, the compound was under assault. There was some breaking news at that point. When it was pretty sensational at the moment, and the very next time that the press corps got in front of Jay Carney, the White House spokesman, their first question was something like, this was during the campaign, did President Obama sleep well last night? Yeah. What's for dinner? I mean, these were the kinds of questions they asked, and it's just like, it seems to bounce off their brains. And then, of course, there is also the element that is protective of him and does not want to have anything stop the forward motion of the administration.
Well, do you feel that the Obama administration manipulates and exploits the press through access and limiting access to?
Absolutely. I mean, this we do know, and I think that this is not unique to the Obama administration, but I think it has been taken to a higher level. I think that, that is a Washington game, but under the Obama administration, we have seen more and more, and some journalists have actually written about this, and I have been...
Have you experienced it?
I have experienced it. It wasn't an access so much, but it's control of the message to a point where you have New York Times reporters, glossy magazine reporters, submitting their copy to the White House for approval, for quote approval. I once attended a lunch with Janet Napolitano, and the ground rules were that everything was off the record until the people, there was maybe a luncheon of about a dozen journalists, wrote their stories. They were supposed to submit them to the press secretary for approval. And I wrote a column about the practice. I wrote a column sort of trying to expose what was going on in the sense of, they told us this, I asked a question about this, I got approval to say this. I was very open about what was going on. And something, I refused to play ball in the sense I think they turned something down, and I didn't even, I told what had happened, but I wouldn't print what they wanted me to print. It was something like that. But they are masters of manipulation of the media, and access is considered coin of the realm. And I really don't know why, because these are always going to be canned responses anyway. But, it's sort of the old game of your source and your story, and it's...
Do you feel that Barack Obama is at the head of this statist movement, or is he a cog in an even greater machine?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, he's the President of the United States. We certainly don't see someone pulling strings, but...
You don't see the strings.
No, you don't see the strings. I think that it's fair to say he did come up in a network. He did come up in with mentors who are connected by their ideological extremism, starting with Frank Marshall Davis and going on, and there is a lot of evidence about his connections to Bill Ayers and so on, and the unions that have had such tremendous entree into the White House. So it's hard to take a step and say aha, but it's certainly an ideological coterie. And he is the president.
But is American betrayal really about this administration, or is it about a greater force in the world that's taking place, or that has taken place and is taking place in the world?
Well, it is not about the administration per se. It is the administration, in a sense, is kind of the rabbit hole, and then the book. You go down the rabbit hole with the rest of the book, but it's the movement away from liberty, citizenship, the Constitution. I mean, these have unfortunately been the forces that have degraded our country and degraded our Constitution, degraded our liberties. So, in a sense, that is the American betrayal. Unfortunately, what I uncovered, what I learned to my own dismay, was that many of the people responsible are some of the people we have on statues, around Washington, D.C., presidents, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, people who have never answered for how they contributed to this loss of liberty.
Well, good luck with the book, and
Thank you.
and thank you very much for speaking with
Oh,
us.
thank you very much. Thank you.
And for not dropping.
Thank